Yes. Dubey sir,
Okay,
you can start.
okay, thank you. So, good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to Donald, who is our speaker today. uh, it's very nice to be back with a large number of people joining the Indore study circle, and I want to express uh, a deep sense of thankfulness to Donald Creedon, who had kindly agreed to our request to speak before this group. I wanted to have his talk much earlier, but because of time differences in two zones, it was not possible earlier. But I'm happy Donald is with us today. And Donald is going to talk to us on the theme, the Uncharted Voyage, perspectives on thought, insight, and meditation in Krishnamurti and Buddhism. People who are not associated with Rajghat may not know Donald, so I'll briefly introduce Donald to all of us. Donald Creedon was born and educated in Dublin, Ireland. At the age of 19, he came across Krishnaji and attended his talks in Sanin. He was deeply affected by the Krishnamurti's presence and the teachings. The message seemed straightforward and unambiguous. However, after some years listening at the feet of the master, he felt stuck and went to study with Buddhist masters from Tibet. Although he states he had no interest in becoming a Buddhist, he left his job as a civil servant and spent 12 years in enclosed retreats. During that time, he was appointed retreat master of a 3-year retreat. In spite of appearances, Krishnamurti remained a constant and invisible presence, challenging at every step. Later, at the behest of late Mr. Rajesh Dalal, he took up the Biddha Krishnamurti scholarship in Rajghat. The outcome was published as The Main of Light, Common Ground and Dividing Lines in the Teachings of J. Krishnamurti and Buddhism, which he says is an inquiry into the ways of exploring the fundamental questions of life. Until the arrival of COVID, Donald was involved in retreats in various parts of the world. With these words, I welcome Donald once again, and I'll request Donald to please start your discourse. And you can take as long as you want, but normally anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour, after which we'll invite questions. So, Donald, the field is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to speak. As you probably will know from your own study and contemplation of Krishnamurti's teaching, that it's very, very difficult actually to, in a short time, to speak of the teachings and for the simple reason that the teachings are vast and profound, and also the ideal situation to explore the teachings is a situation where we have time and leisure and to go into the teachings slowly, with a lot of silence, space, and so forth. So I'm saying this by way of an excuse in case what I say doesn't make much sense to you, which is quite possible. But when I was thinking about the topic, because I was asked to come up with a topic, and what I have suggested was this theme of thought and insight and meditation, this just came to mind. But I may wander away from these particular topics into other areas. We'll just see what comes up. But I thought just to start with what Krishnaji, in his very last talk, in Chennai, or as it was called in Madras. He said a few things. He said, and I thought this was something, extraordinary. In the very last, if you look at the transcripts of his talk, his last talk, he referred to the origin of life. He referred to as the origin of life as something very serious. That's something we can't play around with. And he said that there's no words, no description can ever describe the origin. He says it's nameless. He says it's absolutely quiet. He says this creation is something most holy, the most sacred thing in life. So he makes that statement, and then he adds, if you've made a mess of your life, change it. Change it today, not tomorrow. And then he says, if you are uncertain, find out why and be certain. And then he says, if your thinking is not straight, think straight logically. And he adds, unless all that is prepared, all that is settled, you can't enter into this world, into the world of creation. And that was his final statement. It's something very extraordinary and moving about those words. But as often is the case with Krishnaji, he doesn't explain things. He makes very strong, communicates something profound, and which may strike us in a way directly to our own hearts. And at the same time, and I speak for myself, I don't quite understand what he's saying, but I feel it's true. You feel in the depths of your being that it's true. And you're moved to the depths of your being through the words and what is beyond the words and what is coming from that pure source. But then, almost casually, maybe that's not right to say, he makes say, if you've made a mess of your life, then clear up the mess. Change it. Don't wait. If you don't think straight, and so forth. And then he adds, if this is not prepared, then you cannot enter the world of creation. So I was struck by this, these few words, and this point that Krishnaji makes, that if this is not prepared, then the other is not possible. This seems to be what he implies. I think, speaking for myself, I think I've spent a lot of my life trying to straighten out my thinking, and also to clear up the various complications in my own head and my own life, clearing up the mess. And it seems that it's not, that is not so simple, not so straightforward, but maybe I'll come back to that later. But I just wanted to start with that as the kind of touchstone of our exploration today. But I'll just shift to another, something different, but not unconnected with this. And this is an old story. It's an old story from Ireland. And it reminds me a little of the stories from the Mahabharata, or the Upanishad rather, the story of Nachiketa. Not quite the same, but the central figure is a young guy, a boy or a young man. And I'll briefly outline the story, and I think you'll see the point of it. In this story, and it takes place, before Christianity, thousands of years ago, and it takes place in somewhere on the west coast of Ireland, beside the great billowing sea, the Atlantic, and it takes place in a, you could say, in a community or in a clan. So the story goes that there is something amiss. That something has gone wrong. There's something that is affecting the people. And it's not affecting, in the story it says they're suffering from a wasting illness. And it's not all like physical, but in their being, they would say in their souls, they're wasting away. And there is a sense of meaninglessness. So it's recognized that there's a problem and there's something has to be done about it. So the boy, or the young man, he's somehow nominated by the elders to find the solution to the problem. And so he goes to the old woman, the wise old woman of the clan, and she says, you have to go to the other world. You have to go to the other world. And you have to go to the well, the source in the other world. You have to drink the water from the well. You have to bring the water back to us. But the problem is, nobody knows how to get to the other world. There's no map. There's no Google map. There's no road that leads to that world. And so there is this issue. Now the story goes, the boy, he dreams one night, he dreams of this time a young woman. And the young woman whispers something to him and she hands him a silver branch. So he wakes from the dream and he's holding the silver branch. But in the morning light, the branch disappears. The dream woman said to him, you have to learn the silver branch seeing. This is what is needed to enter the other world. So then, to cut a long story short, he sets out on the typical voyage across the sea, and it may take, who knows, years. And eventually he has this silver branch seeing, so he can go and draw from the waters of the well, return to his place, and he's sitting beside the fireplace in winter. It's not like the Indian winter here in Ireland. It's cold, it's wet, you need a fire. He's back home and everything has changed. The whole place has changed. His way of seeing has changed and the people have changed. But he realizes he never needed to have taken that voyage. But it was there all the time. The truth was there all the time. It was just a matter of opening the eyes and seeing. So that's the story in a very crude and rough way. But I was struck by this story because of this issue, the issue of seeing, the issue of hearing, the issue of listening. And I think from the very beginning, Krishnaji pointed out the absolute importance of seeing. You know, he would say sometimes, if we can just see and listen, then more or less that's it. That we could say the whole problem, the whole fault lies in the inability to see. To see what? To see how things actually are. So like the boy, I'm not comparing myself to the boy in the story, but it just comes to mind that in the same way I listened to Krishnaji and Sanan in my youth. I was very moved by what he said. It made a big impression. I loved what he said. I also loved Krishnaji. His presence was something very extraordinary and beautiful, and I felt blessed to be there. But I couldn't see. That was the problem. I couldn't see. And I realized that within maybe a few years of reading the books of thinking, contemplating, meditating, not meditating, and so forth. So then, because I had read something about the Buddhists, and they had given a lot of attention also to these issues, I thought I'll try these Buddhists and see what they're up to. And so, you know, you make a little choice, a so-called choice, and you go down a particular track, and then everything changes after that. Your life, you find your life was going in a direction you never really thought about or anticipated. So this was, in brief, what happened for me. I felt at the time that the Buddhists I met, the Lamas I met, they were serious people. They fitted what Krishnaji talked about being serious. They were serious about the problems of living. They were serious about the problem of suffering. They were serious about the problem of sorrow. They were also saying the problem of suffering, sorrow, lies in the human being, in the consciousness which is afflicted, which is basically ignorant, and the fundamental problem there is sometimes put in different ways: ignorance or craving and so forth. So then. Okay, so this is without going into a whole lot of detail about my own life. This is how I moved in my own, call it, journey. And of course, when you go into a tradition, an old tradition, you come up against with all the things that Krishnaji often spoke very stridently against: tradition, hierarchy, structures, methodologies, and all the extraordinary, things that go with tradition. And in a way, what I found, it seemed like what we call Tibetan Buddhism was the very opposite to what from the simplicity of the Krishnaji's message. But for some reason, maybe karma, I stuck it out and stayed with that. Over the years, and in the process, I felt also very fortunate in the people and the teachers that I met. But just to go back to this whole question of what do we call looking or listening or reading, one of the things, there are the teachings. Teachings of Krishnamurti. And as we know, just in terms of the quantity, there are huge number of the written word, the recordings and so forth. So the teachings are vast and the contents are vast. If we talk about the Buddhist teachings, we come up against a similar thing, maybe even much more complex, of course. A vast array of teachings. So how does one even begin to approach the teachings? And I think here is where is some kind of crucial point, as far as I understand, is that how we see the teachings, and how whether we see the teachings as in the same way as we see, like we pick up a book about a particular subject. Supposing the subject is astronomy, and we read about it and we learn to know about it. So the book of Krishnaji or the Sutra of the Buddha, do we pick up the book in the same way? Do we read the book in the same way? Do we read the book for knowledge, and how do we read the book? So I think this is one of the interesting points about meeting the teachings and so forth. So just to give an idea of different ways, and here I'll just say it's a book. So any of the books, the notebook, or any of the discourses of Krishnaji, how do we read that book? So there are different ways of reading. You could read it, you could skim through it like I was doing this morning, looking through to find something to hang on to so I can talk now. You know, I skimmed through and find a suitable quote, and I didn't really find, or we can read the book and memorize a few phrases of Krishnaji or the Buddha, or we can carefully read the book. We can study it and contemplate it and read it quietly and absorb it in that way. And we can read it in a way with the mind. But there's also perhaps another way of reading it, which is what I think is the crucial way, is what you might call is reality reading. So a different kind of reading. So in this kind of reading, you yourself are the book. And you yourself are the book. You're reading the book Krishna with Krishnamurti's name on it. But it's if we really want, this is my feeling, that book, you have to read it in a different way. It's call it reality reading. The book is about oneself. The book of one's own life. So the exact same thing, I think, applies to the Buddhist teachings of the Buddha Dharma. And of course, although maybe it's a bit arrogant to say that, but within tradition, it's often, again, the sutras, whatever, are taken as something out there, as separate from the reader or the student, to be understood in a particular way, but not as something which is saying something to me or to you about our life, about our mind. And so this is how I would see it now. The book is pointing to something. And we have to say, what is it telling me? What is it saying about my life? What's it saying about my thinking? When Krishnaji said, if your life is in a mess, and if your thinking is not so, what is he saying to me? You know, what is he saying? What is it in me that is that mess, that, you know, messy thinking and so forth? So I think there's a saying which I came across in a Buddhist text. It says that the truth, the Dharma, is abundantly inherent in everyone. The truth is there. And this would be the Buddhist way, but without practice, it will not be revealed. Of course, we might hear that and think, practice, no, that's out. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go and practice X, Y, and Z and do some kind of but this word practice is used unless it's lived, you know, unless we somehow can enter into that world and it becomes part of our living, then it won't reveal itself. The truth that Krishnaji has talked about won't reveal itself. This is something which I feel is the case. Now, one of the things in the little bit that I read from Krishnaji's last talk, where he said, unless this is all prepared, then you cannot enter the sacred. So what does that mean? What if we look at it as a voyage or a journey? What kind of provision? First of all, I see that I don't see. I don't understand. I don't understand this statement, the observer is the observed, or the statement, I am the world, you are the world. I can logically figure out this statement, but it's not the way I see things. For me, the observer and the observed are the fact, are how things appear to me. That I'll come back to that in a little bit. So what do we need for what kind of preparation? Krishnaji denies time, you know, so how can there be a preparation which doesn't involve time? I don't actually know the answer to that. perhaps there is a way of working which isn't bound to time. I do feel there is a way, even though chronologically one may be working on this for years, but one is still chronologically in the temporal zone, as it were, but psychologically one is not bound by the psychological time. Now, I wasn't planning to go into that topic. It's another big topic, but I would suggest certain let's say, provisions are needed for this journey. Provisions are necessary for this journey. For instance, and this is when Krishnamurti says change the mess and be certain. When he said, if you're not certain, be certain, is he talking about some kind of faith, if I can use that word, some kind of deep trust, some kind of faith? Now, I don't know how it is in India, but in the West, if you use the word faith, a lot of people have an allergic reaction to it. They immediately jump into this is all some kind of primitive disbelief and we're rational, sane people. From my experience of India, Indian folk are much more flexible about things. You're not so, yeah. Anyway, so when he says to be certain, what do we need to be certain about? What is that kind of certainty? And so in the Buddhist way, if we're going into this, this is one they said that to make the journey is just you need to have the mind of, first of all, deep caring and trust, a deep faith. This trusting faith is not linked necessarily to anything external. You could say we trust Krishna Ji, feel he was somebody extraordinary. He didn't tell lies, he told the truth. So implicit, even though the person is not central, there is anyone who was in his presence would feel, I think, that, just a kind of a trust in the person. But it's not trust, faith. What I'm getting at here is not about the person or about the object, but it's an intimation of the truth, a feeling for truth, which abides in the heart of the seeker, and is a movement away from the confusion of the thought-based consciousness. So, and then the journey is there. This is something we find in a Buddhist text. In some, they talk about disentangling that which is tangled up, disentangling, a kind of a straightening out of one's life on different levels. But I won't. So I won't go into that. I think that would take us to a little off track from the central point of what I'm supposed to talk about. So let's just for the moment look at this issue. Look at what is the problem. Like the boy in the story, we know there's human beings. There's a problem in the human realm, among human beings that made a mess. And we see the awful catastrophes around the world. We see all the hatred, the divisions, the stupidity, the greed that is manifesting in our earth, and it's literally destroying the earth. So what is the root of that? Now, of course, Krishna Ji has pointed out the roots of it. And the Buddha also pointed out the roots of it. So, and the very roots of it are also the roots of the human sorrow, suffering, conflict, and so forth. Now, in the, I just wanted to mention this, and then I'll get on to this issue of thought. But Krishna, sometimes early on in his teaching, he talked sometimes about craving as a root problem. And of course, in the Buddhist teaching, this was identified as one of the root problems. So craving here is not just that I like certain things, that I like a particular type of smartphone, or that I like music, or I desire certain things, but it's a more deep-rooted movement, propulsive movement that is there pushing in the human psyche day and night with tremendous force. This is the craving. In the Buddhist way of looking at things, the human beings belong to the desire realm. So it's fueled by craving. And that craving, that grasping is, you can see the force of it in the world today. We can see the force, like the consumerism. So we're all consumers, and we're all encouraged to be consumers. For the economy to go well, we have to consume more and more things we don't need. And so this craving, this deep-rooted craving, is fed constantly. And it offers us all kinds of things. But in the end, what it gives us is sorrow and pain, suffering, dukkha. This is not a moralistic stance from on high, but this is how it works out in terms of the cause and effect. Because where is that craving coming from? What is the source of it in the human heart or mind? This is the other question. So craving. The other, in the Buddha Dharma, which I think is better than talking about Buddhism, Buddha Dharma, it's ignorance is identified as the core issue. And also, I think in Krishnaji's teaching, ignorance is seen as the core. The root of all problems is the ignorance. And as Krishnaji said, and it's in the Buddha's teachings also, this ignorance is not the lack of knowledge, the lack of information, the lack of a certain kind of education, but it's a fundamental mistake and a fundamental flaw that is there, a fundamental misperception, which seems to be there from the very beginning. A kind of a mistaken, let's say, a mistake in the very consciousness of the human being. So ignorance plays itself out, is shown and here in both Krishnaji and I think in Buddha talk about this, about consciousness, about how consciousness is consciousness. First of all, when I talk about consciousness, we have to define it in a certain way, because maybe in the Buddhist field they talk about it in a certain way. Maybe in Vedanta and the Vedas they speak about it in a different way. But in the Buddhist sutras and texts on consciousness, when they talk about consciousness, it means dualistic. It means that consciousness is flawed fundamentally. The whole operating system of consciousness is fundamentally flawed in it. And the fundamental flaw in consciousness is the split between the subject and object, the dualism. So it goes much further than this, you know. So when we think sometimes that there's a problem, there's just a problem in part of the consciousness that has to be resolved, but certainly, as far as I understand what Krishnaji says, and the Buddhist talking about, saying no, it's much, the whole of consciousness is afflicted. In the Buddhist, there's a very interesting, they equate consciousness with false imagination. There's a particular Sanskrit term that's used there, and I'm not sure my Sanskrit pronunciation is not probably good, but it's abhuta parikalpa. I'm not familiar with Sanskrit, but I know Tibetan. I know the Tibetan language a little bit, and the translation that in Tibetan means it's fundamentally not true. And that it's also, the whole field of consciousness is a field of imagination, of fabrication, of conceptualization, and so forth. So there's a fundamental issue there in consciousness. And with that, with consciousness, is the whole problem of thought. Now, just a little on that whole consciousness issue. Krishnaji often, when he spoke about consciousness, he said consciousness and the contents of consciousness is the content. There's no consciousness without the content. He has said that the solution is the consciousness has to be emptied of its content. And again, which was the Krishnaji didn't, as far as I can find out, he didn't particularly go into a lot of detail about this. And personally, I was always struck by that statement about consciousness and consciousness and the content of consciousness are the same. There's no consciousness apart from the content. And that the emptying of consciousness was absolutely necessary. And that in itself seems like almost impossible. Of course, the question is, how does that come about? What does it mean? What is the content of consciousness? It's only in certain areas where I was looking at this in some Buddhist texts on consciousness where I found something quite similar. Without going into details about what the Buddhists talk about consciousness, but one of their key terms, concepts, let's say, of consciousness is the notion of a ground consciousness, of a source consciousness, which is called alaya consciousness or alaya consciousness. And this alaya consciousness and what Krishnaji says about consciousness and the content seem to me very similar. Now, I'm not here just to do a comparative talk about the two, but to get at some kind of difficulties that are there in the in this issue. Somebody has begged to disagree, and that's fine. We can talk about it. Okay, I'll come back to this comment later of what Krishnaji said. Anyway, so this issue, of the content of consciousness and how it's resolved. I found within the some Buddhist texts on this, it said that, however, within that whole field of consciousness, there is an aspect which can actually clear the whole of consciousness. So the content of consciousness fade away and they disappear altogether. And what is the factor that allows or which let's say, which does that? Interestingly, it says listening. The listening, an innate capacity to listening will clear that. This is just a footnote to the talk, and I want to now go on to this whole, which I was supposed to talk about, is thought and the issue with thought, insight, and meditation. So just a little about that. Now, as we know, this is the other aspect we find in the teachings of Krishnamurti and also Buddhist teaching. The teachings are vast, but often there will be a key point, and a key point in all of the teachings which point out a way, let's say, a way out or a way in. And this is why it seems so important to identify what are the problems and where the problems are and how to identify the problems. If the problem is not identified, then we're kind of stuck in that wheel. So one of the interesting things is that as you will know, Krishnaji pointed out, thought is the problem of thought is central to the human problem. If the problem of thought is, let's say, resolved, then this is the kind of then the whole of the field is resolved. The whole of the field is resolved if this single issue is resolved. Now, so the problem of thought is well articulated by Krishnamurti and David Bohm in particular. And without going on into it in too much, I just wanted to mention a few things about it. And here I have to look up something. Well, maybe I won't bother looking up. But basically, the thought divides. This is the first thing. The thought is limited. Thought creates its own reality. It is constantly active in our perceptual field and constantly, let's say, creating something literally out of nothing. So thought is quite extraordinary, and thought can think itself in any way. I think there are even some practitioners of non-duality who think their way into non-duality, because thought is so subtle and clever in its ways that it can fabricate in so many ways. So it is really something quite extraordinary, thought. However, as Krishnaji, David Bohm, the Buddhist masters say, thought is limited. It cannot transcend itself. It cannot go beyond itself. And so one of the problems with thought is that it is like it's in the wrong place. Instead of, thought is like at the center of the me, the center is thought, and that is where the human being operates from. So there are many things, there are many statements in Krishnaji and in Buddhism. So for example, this is a quote from a Buddhist master who says, thought unrecognized is the chain of delusion which creates samsara. Samsara being the world of bewilderment, ignorance, and so forth. He says, thought unrecognized is the chain of delusion. And I've come across many statements of this kind, which identify thought as the problem. Another master from Tibet, and in those lores you talk about obstacles, about maras, about demons, about all kinds of things that can disrupt your life. But this master Longchenpa says they can all be brought down to thought. Thought is again the culprit, if we want to label it like that. So that's clear in a certain way. But then the next question arises, well, what do we do or what do we not do? And here's where I think there is, let's say, some interesting questions arise. And one of the things that Krishnaji has talked about, he says, thought has to end. And I was looking at, I won't bother digging out the quotes, but where he talks about the ending of thought is the ending of sorrow. It's in his notebook. And several points he talks about the ending of thought. So it would seem from these statements that the issue with thought, the solution is to end thought. And inevitably we ask the question, well, how we can put it, say, how does this come about? What do we do about it? How can it come? But one of the issues which I would draw your attention to in this is just, even though I'm not, when Krishnamurti talks about thought ending, and this is my own say, I think this is difficult. There's a difficulty there. There's even a difficulty in the notion, and I may misunderstand, that to find the otherness, thought has to end. And if I can bring a Buddhist element into this, in certain teachings, foundational teachings of the Buddhists, although they don't use the word thought, they say the samsara has to end, craving has to end. We have to get off the wheel and into the other. Off the wheel of samsara, and then there's nirvana, the ending of that. So in a certain way, it talks about the ending of something in order for the other. This approach was actually criticized within the Buddhism by Nagarjuna, no less. Because there was a flaw seen in this thing. There was still an issue here. So the question is, does it come down to the issue of thought and no thought? The solution to the problem is the absence of thought or the ending of thought. In other words, the ending of the samsara and the other. So there we run into this division in a way between the, let's say, the world and the transcendent. It may not be what one never knows, because I think with Krishnaji, with his teachings, they were not fixed, or he was incredibly fluid and spoke in different ways in different situations. I mean, there's a consistency, of course, right throughout the teachings. But when he was questioned very rigorously on some of these issues, he would often say, of course, obviously, sir, and he would move with that. But the difficulty is for me, and not for you, if we take this thought must end, and that becomes our aim. I think there's some problems with that. So immediately this is taken up as an idea and how to implement it. I would say there's a different approach to this issue of thought. You won't find it generally in most of the Buddhist teachings. The Buddhist teachings, general teachings, see that thought is an issue. So they say, let go of thought. Just let go. Don't hold on to it, let go of it. In a certain line of teachings which came from India, from Saraha in India, and which is called Mahamudra, they treat this in a different way. And I think it's a very interesting way they treat it. And first of all, they state, thought itself isn't really the problem. No, it is a problem. As the quote is, it's a problem because it's not recognized, or the nature of thought is not recognized. That there's a problem there, and all the confusion ensues from that. But they say, per se, the problem is in, let's put it, the relationship with thought, the relationship between the thinker and the thought, the way the thought is perceived, the way on the ordinary level, the way thought appears to the mind and is construed by the observer. So this is how, within that stream, just to share this, how thought is talked about. First of all, thought is like the enemy. Thought is the problem maker. Thought creates all kinds of confusions and problems. So it's the enemy. And then you have various ways of dealing with the enemy. Okay, but this is very, very limited and a little bit even primitive, one could say. What is said in this line of inquiry is actually the main thing is that the nature of thought is not understood. There's a misunderstanding relating to thought. So thought appears in a certain way due to, again, to a misunderstanding of thought. According to this way of thinking, of this way of inquiry, and it's a meditative way, it's not intellectual, it's a direct, this approach is called taking direct perception as the path of the way. So if one is following this through, it's not the matter of reading about it, but of observing one's own thought and inquiring into the thoughts. But the difficulty, and just if I approach this issue of thought thinking it has to end, I'm already, as it were, affecting my own inquiry. I already have an agenda. I already have some kind of prejudice towards the thought itself. And that will not enable the observer to perceive the thought or to know it in terms of a direct perception. So just to take this a little further, in this trajectory, it says something like, first, the thought is an enemy. Secondly, the thought is a friend. And the third is thought is meditation. This is very different. Thought is meditation. So how could that be? You might say, no, this has gone too far. But then we'd have to go into that. So what is first of all, thought is a problem, and then thought is the friend. How does that take place? Well, I can only say, and as somebody who's very interested in this type of inquiry, and I'm not saying I understand anything about it, but I feel there's something to it. But the inquirer or the meditator has to look carefully at his or her own experience and to see what is arising in the moment. Where is it? What is the relationship of the thought that appears in the mind to awareness or to space? Can one see that? Can one identify that? And it may happen when one does this that it leads to a certain doubt and even confusion, because I think this is just how it is. So, however, as the process of inquiry goes on, what is taking place? This would be the thinking is the inquirer is bringing their own intelligence, and this is why Krishnaji says, leave everything else, forget the books, forget everything, forget Buddhism, forget what Krishnamurti has written about it. In this line that I'm talking about, they say the same. They say, don't bring any book into this. Forget about what you've learned in the tradition. That will only impede the inquiry. So we look at thought. What is it? How is it? And in the looking at the thought, the very, let's say, innate intelligence of the meditator is, as it were, constellated or brought forth. So it may happen that a different kind of understanding starts to take place in the mind of the inquirer. Therefore, the thought is no longer seen as something separate. It's not something separate from the perceiver, from the perceiving mind. Of course, Krishnaji says that. The observer, the thinker is the thought. But for this to happen in actuality is, I think, I don't think there's any way you can formulate it in a kind of a easy way. But so then, when they say thought is a friend, what does that mean? So first of all, the thought, which first of all Krishnamurti says is a material process, is matter, is material process. It would seem from the thought is something like an invasive species, but then the thought is very much not separate from the mind, from the thinker, from the mind itself. So how do the two go together? How does mind and thought, how does awareness and thought, how do they relate? So I think where this perhaps leads to is a kind of an understanding that the awareness itself, that the mind itself and thought are not two. They're not two. They're not dual. They're not two. When that occurs, then the thought itself is no longer something other to be dealt with, but the dynamic expression of the mind itself. So this is where I think the call it a change takes place in the perceiver and the thought, in the thinker and the thought. Now, and then, as I said, a final statement about this: thought itself is meditation, is not separate from meditation. Again, this is an extraordinary statement. It's not one you generally find in most things you might read about Buddhism, the popular books and all that. But this is something I have come across myself in that line. And so what does that mean? Because this goes against all our thinking about thought. So I just, now, the other, because I've almost spoken for an hour, and so I'll stop. I'll just try to cover very quickly in a few minutes the other points. The insight. So, insight. Okay. What is insight? The seeing into. You know, what are there different kinds of insight? Krishnaji doesn't countenance different kinds. There's just the seeing directly, and that's it. Now, I'm very reluctant to bring in levels, but there are different. There's in the Buddhist, for example, you read Krishnamurti, you read the books, you read the words. There's a certain clarification that takes place in the reader. The reader may not have a direct perception of the truth, but there's a clarification in thought. There's some kind of insight happening. There's some aha happening in the process. It may be limited, but it clears something. It clears something in the thought field, in the perceptual field. So in the Buddhists, they say, yeah, this is a kind of prajna, this Sanskrit word, intelligence. This is some intelligence is coming forth through the close reading. Then you discuss it. We have debates. We have dialogues. Again, there's a process of prajna coming forth in that. Still not, I think, limited, but still there's a clarification taking place. But the essential to cut the root of the problem is the direct perception, the direct perception of what is, how it is, and so. Now, okay, now meditation, another big, vast subject. Krishnaji talks about meditation in a very extraordinary, beautiful way. I think there's very few accounts I've come across about concerning meditation that are more beautiful than evocative than what Krishnaji has written about meditation. He talks about meditation in the sense, if I can put it this way, and this is just my thoughts, the flower has bloomed, the lotus has bloomed, and the perfume is there. He talks in that way, you know, and you're moved by this. And maybe by listening or by reading, one gets some sense of that. His very talking about it is like an invitation. He dismisses all the methods, all the traditions. What a relief that is to hear that, you know. And I say that as somebody who's been through the traditional mill, you know, without regret. But what a relief it is to hear something like that, and to hear somebody speak in that way from the source that he spoke about in his last talk, to speak in that flowering that is in bloom, all the qualities, we could say of Krishna, all the qualities of the Buddha, the immense compassion, intelligence, is showing itself in that meditation, in when he talks about meditation. Now, the difficulty, though, is that for me, I'm not, I can listen as far as I can, but the question is, how does that come about? How does that flowering take place in a human being and in you and in I? And quite clearly, the methods cannot bring that about for very good reasons, because they're constructed, they're fabrications, they are, created by thought and mind. They may be some extraordinary methodologies that could be helpful, but they in themselves eventually obstruct the flowering. However, it may be that in an individual's journey, he or she may have recourse to some, as it were, methods which will straighten out certain things in the body-mind. I think in India you have tremendous traditions dealing with the body, the energies in the body, the channels in the body, the whole notion of the prana and the nadi and bindu and so forth. So there's something in these traditions which could be helpful if one is obstructed. Now, in brief, mostly when you read books on Buddhist meditation, you find lots of techniques, lots of methods, and so forth. And to find something which is close to what Krishnaji is talking about, then one would have to look at those siddhas who came from India, like Saraha and Tilopa and Maitripa, who sang songs. They didn't tell you how to do it. They made a few comments, they made a few statements, and communicated something of that. And then these traveled into Tibet, and the Tibetan adepts worked on those over the years and kept them alive. But in some ways, I don't see those essential teachings on the nature of meditation in the Mahamudra Dzogchen tradition of Tibet. What Krishnaji says, I don't see there's a contradictions there. The same points are made about the mind fabricating. The fabrication has to, as it were, be dealt with, or to the fabrication will impede the blossoming of the lotus and the flowering of goodness, the flowering of intelligence, and so forth. So I should leave it at this because I've talked for longer than I'm supposed to, and I'm sorry, my apologies if I wandered here and there and didn't quite cover the topic. So if there are any points or questions for discussion.
Thank you, Donald. I think you have covered beautifully, starting from listening to ignorance, and then thought, meditation, and insight, and brought in Buddhism to explain it further. I think it was beautiful. Before we take up questions, I see 2-3 hands being raised up. Would you like to comment on what Mr. Hareshwar Singh wrote, where he has disagreed with you on ignorance? Would you like to say something on that? You want me to read it?
Yeah, so I have it, I've read it. Yeah, of course, yeah, I wouldn't disagree with the statement. But he did, as far as I'm aware, he did speak on this topic of ignorance. I have, but let's leave it at that. I don't, don't disagree.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think we'll take up Dr. Harshad Parekh first and then Mr. Dinesh Waghmare. Yes, sir, please unmute yourself.
Yes. Are you able to hear my voice?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Donald. It was very good to listen to you. In Buddhism, I find the story of Angulimal very, very interesting because though he had lived a life of lot of crime, he had killed many people, but the first time he comes to listen to Buddha, there's something new happens. So in spite of living, having many problems, there is something within us. There's still the possibility of listening in a different way, like the way Angulimal listened. On the other hand, Devdatta, who was Buddha's cousin, and he was a respected monk in Buddha's Sangha for many, many years. And he could speak very beautifully, but he was not free from jealousy, and he wanted the position of Buddha, and even he tried to kill Buddha through some ways. So what I find is that there is the possibility of listening something which triggers something within us. And like Kondana, when Buddha gave the first talk after his enlightenment to his 5 friends, Kondana got it very quickly. And Buddha looked at Kondana's face and said, Kondana, you have got it. So how one gets it, that is a mystery. And what I feel, the thought is not the enemy. Thought, of course, creates many, many problems in only when there is no awakening of awareness or intelligence. But with the awakening of awareness, which is not thinking, that awareness or intelligence can see very clearly how thought is coming and what it is doing. So I do not consider that thought is an enemy, but there is a possibility of seeing how thoughts is moving without creating the thinker, that division between thinker and thought. Because this thinker is actually coming from thought. And once this thinker comes, then it wants to change and says, I like it, I don't like it. So that duality comes. But otherwise, thinking can move very beautifully without thinker in the field of awareness or intelligence. And that is lacking in most human beings because I think it is there, but hidden under the dense layers of thinking. And since our life is mostly a continuity in thinking without awareness, this awareness is blocked. So one needs a kind of silence to, or a discontinuity in thinking for this awareness to come up from the bottom, and the awareness comes on the top, and then it can look at thoughts very, very clearly. It is like looking from above in the third dimension, what is happening on the flat surface. So thinking and feeling are like a flat surface, and awareness is in the third dimension, which can look very clearly at thinking and feeling. And then it doesn't create any problem. So this is what I have said enough. Thank you. I have finished.
Thank you. Thank you, Harshad Bhai.
Thank you very much.
We have a question from Mr. Dinesh Waghmare. Yes, please go ahead.
Sir, are you able to listen to me?
Yes.
You have talked about this craving and ignorance. What is your actual understanding of this craving and ignorance? Does it the incompleteness of the spirit of a man or person? And does it this uses thought as the instrument and creates the maze what you have talked? And what is your idea about the maze in the life? Shall I repeat, sir?
Unmute yourself. Unmute, Daniel.
Are you able to listen to me?
Yes, I've heard your question. I will try to.
Shall I repeat the question?
No, I've understood the question about ignorance and so forth. There is again a text which I'll quote from. It says something very simple. It says there's one ground and there's two possibilities. It says that the ground is recognized and there's freedom. And then the ground is not recognized. Then there is confusion, samsara. So this ground is sometimes referred to is the ground of all, the a source of all. Not recognized, then we have the word in English word ignore. It's ignored, not seen. So because of that mistake, some other ground is created, the ground of the self. And from the ground of the self, there is self and other, there is all the complications around that. This is putting it in a very, like a simple way. So it says, the ground not recognized, then all of the confusion of what the Buddhists call samsara ensues from this non-recognition. And conversely, if the ground is recognized, then there is no confusion, there's the freedom, and there is the qualities of the freedom, this which it would be spoken of like compassion, intelligence, and so forth. In terms of our own, let's say, journey, how would one relate to that? Again, in the Buddhist stream, which is dealing with, as I say, come from the siddhas of India, they say everything is in the mind itself. So this ground, call it ground, it's not ground in a solid way. This source is mind itself. But that source, mind itself, has not been recognized. It's like the old question of who am I? Who am I? Who is the source? So this non-recognition is when you use the word ignorance, I think the word in the Sanskrit word avidya, Tibetan word for that is marikpa. Marikpa means absence of awareness. Awareness is no longer freely functioning, and you have division. So in the individual, you and me, so that fundamental non-recognition is the source, therefore, of the dualistic confusion and so forth. So by looking into one's own mind, they say, simply looking at the mind itself, or looking at thought, or looking at awareness, and a kind of direct perception of the nature of the mind, direct perception of the nature of awareness or thought itself, then as it were, the root of the problem is cut through. So we have within the Buddhist field, we have complex, or not we, there is a complex approach to this. If you want a complex approach, you look at Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Asanga, all those great philosophical geniuses, they took the inferential route, complex, brilliant in its own way. The direct route, direct perception, then this would be the path, what they call it, the siddhas, direct perception, looking directly at your own mind. But that mistake, you know, I identify myself as Donal, Irish, certain, all of that. That's my identity. But this is like, okay, that's how it is in a like conventional or a relative way. But that grasping at an image or identity is a fundamental error. Part of the this call it ignorance. So, okay.
Thank you, Donald. I think before we take up Mr. Pradeep Verma's and Mr. Shankar's question, may I request Professor Krishna to say a few words about ending of thought?
Yeah, I have very carefully listened to Donald. Hi, Donald.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, same here. I have not seriously engaged with Buddhist teachings, but I have seriously engaged with Krishnaji's teachings. And I have 2 or 3 comments which may or may not have value, but which is the way I have experienced things. First of all, Krishnaji talks in the psychological field, but he doesn't always qualify his statements by adding the word psychological. So I have found that when it is very puzzling what he is saying, often if you just remind yourself that this is the psychological field and add the word psychological, it clarifies. So when he talks of time, it's psychological time. When he talks of thought, he's talking of psychological thought, which means judgmental thought or like and dislike, and which produces division. He's not talking about factual thinking. That's one point I wanted to make. The other is that he has often said, put everything in its right place. So it's not correct to talk about rejecting thought, but putting the right thought in its right place. So that itself is part of self-knowledge, to learn through one's own observation what thought can do and what thought cannot do. Because if you don't use thought where thought is necessary, it goes wrong. If you use thought where thought has no role, also it goes wrong. And so to put it, I think Nagarjuna put it in his own words by saying, it is not with thought, it is also not without thought. Or it is not with knowledge and it's also not without knowledge. So he's saying the same thing, that you need to put these in their right place, and no faculty that nature has given us in the course of evolution is completely unnecessary. But we have to learn what is the right use of it. The third point I wanted to make was that ignorance, in my view, is illusion. It's not lack of knowledge. It's illusion, which means you are taking some kind of construct of thought true when it is not true. That means it's not part of nature or part of reality. And it has become reality for you because you have accepted that. So repeatedly, Krishnaji says, don't accept what I say. Investigate it. And for investigating it, it is not just an intellectual investigation, but investigated through watching, through awareness in daily life. Don't disconnect religion from daily life. Otherwise, it becomes an escape. That's how I have understood it. So these were the 3 points I wanted to make for all of you to consider, and particularly Donald. I think more or less he is saying the same thing, but we are putting it in little different words. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
May I ask Mr. Pradeep Verma, please unmute yourself and ask.
Yes. Audible, sir?
Yes.
Audible?
Yes.
Thank you, Donald. Thank you very much for giving a very good summary of everything. A subtle smile on your face throughout speaks volumes about the beauty of complexities of understanding as words different teachers. Then, to me, every life is uncharted voyage that can be verified through reflective consciousness in human beings. Each one of us can review his or her past. When was he sure of the next moment? We are never sure of the next moment. Consciousness gives us that feeling that we are living. And this consciousness, differently, as you have also told, have been differently defined. In that way, Buddhism, I think, is much more inclusive in the sense it starts with organ or sensory consciousness, then goes to subtle consciousness and the subtlest consciousness, and the role of body, very important role of body, which most of the people neglect, or the teachers even say, you are not mind, you are not body, and all those things. So that is very important in Buddhism. They have included individuality also, I believe. They don't think that I is an illusion. So that is one point. Then for Krishna ji, content of consciousness is consciousness. What contains it came to my limited mind. Then the mind is comparable with space. This is what in Buddhism they say, it is space, no inner outer, no finite or infinite. Then another point, our senses work with limited wavelengths. So that limitation will always be there. And that too, when this limited consciousness is conditioned, that adds to the problem further. A number of problems you have already raised very honestly. I was feeling very happy about it. So these are certain points that the more words we use, the more teachings we use, the more rather words, the more the more confused it becomes. So, and simply negating something, that because to make it simple, if we negate that content of consciousness is consciousness, that doesn't answer fully, that doesn't satisfy us. So these are certain questions in my mind, and that they remain there. So first thing in Buddhism, what I found was that body is very important, in which that subtle consciousness enters, and that body, importance of body, then in Vajrayana and all other things, you can understand that that part of Buddhism where so many practices are advised. So body is important. That is what I thought. Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Mr. Verma. Thank you. We can take the question from Mr. Shankar. Please go ahead. Mr. Shankar.
Respected speaker, good evening. And nice to see you here.
Thank you.
Sir, I read Krishnamurti to some extent, and I also read Buddha and all those things in Upanishads. And I did some Vipassana courses, also 2 courses. In my understanding, sir, the total psychological world is false. It doesn't exist. It's all projection of mind. Not only psychological world, even the functional world is also a myth. Mind know how to use the tools. It can use the minerals and build a building. It can plan everything and bring the raw materials and build a building using this body. Mind knows how to gather information and create an image or a belief. So it can, when it is, it can also know how it can build a car, and it can learn how to drive a car, everything. So, but unfortunately, we are dividing it into psychological and physical, functional, and all that. But whatever mind creates, it is all is a myth. It's a projection of this thing, thought. So this world doesn't exist in reality. What exists to some extent, I should say, is the matter around us, which we see through our eyes, which we perceive through senses. That matter exists to some extent. If you go much deeper, again, that is also energy only. So it is not much difficult to understand what I said till now, that world is a myth and all that. It's all a projection of mind. What my question is, even after understanding this, we have no other way but to continue to live in the same world till I leave this body. I have to live among people who are living with illusions. I have to see this, okay, no doubt I can see this world as it is without the mental concepts. That also I can see to some extent in daily life when I'm, when I'm operating in the world, I have to use the mental concepts when I'm dealing with people, dealing with the world. Now my question is, how far this understanding is helpful to me? Only I can escape the suffering. I can escape the suffering, and I don't get carried away. I don't get attached. No doubt, all that is fine. Is there any other thing other than this useful to me? This is my question, sir. Thank you.
Then everything is out.
Well, the only thing I can say about this is, like you say, everything is unreal or illusion. We have to really understand in what way things are illusions, because illusion can be also real. And for instance, in certain Buddhist teachings, they say everything is like a dream. You know, the daily life is the dream. The nighttime dream is a dream. And then when we die, there's another dream waiting. This is a particular. But they say these dreams are also real in a certain way. Ultimately, they are not, they can't be pinpointed as something. So particularly this is like Nagarjuna and all this, they hammer this point that things are there, but they're not there in the way we think they're there. And so the problem is that the human being or the sentient beings reifies or grasps at things that are not intrinsically what we think they are. And this creates the psychological suffering. But the Buddhist, I think Krishnaji, and I think Professor Krishna also referred to in what he was saying about order, things having their right place and thought having its like right place. And the Buddhists would talk, I think, would talk about how they talk about relative truth and ultimate truth, two truths. Krishnaji doesn't talk in this manner. But when they're talking about relative truth, they're talking about like the everyday life that we have to live, and we have to obey the rules or the traffic laws, and there's a certain way one can live with dignity and sanity within the flux of the relative world, of the impermanent, ever-changing world, that even the dualistic world has its own kind of order to it. There can be order within that. And so in certain Buddhist teachings, they give a lot of attention to this, how a human being can make a mess of their lives, and how they can make something decent or a noble life. But it's still within the field of time and becoming. It hasn't gone beyond that. But still, this is reality for us, and it's not. It can't be just. We can't just say it's an illusion. So this is just my thoughts. There is, now this would be a Buddhist thing, and I think Hindu thing, there is like cause and effect, that if we have hatred, this creates untold damage for the one who hates and for those he meets. So we can say the nature of hatred is you can't find anything there. It's empty in nature, but still, hatred is a very powerful force, and so these forces have to be dealt with, and there's a sane way and there's an insane way that a human being can live, and it seems quite a lot of human beings choose the more insane way to live, and that has unfortunate consequences. I just wanted to say one thing as well about all what we were talking about, and like when I talk about Buddhism, also, of course, I'm talking about Buddhist teachings in one way, yeah. But in terms of the individual's journey, it's not like you belong to a particular club and you have hoist the flag of that club against others. This happens, of course. But I think if somebody is a sadhaka, an inquirer, a disciple of truth, then that journey, it might take them to Rajghat. In my case, it did. Or it can take them to somewhere else in the journey, and we meet our teachers everywhere. The whole world is our teacher. So it may take one person into the Buddhist field and another person in a different way. But if call it the seeker or the journey or maintains their inner kind of like integrity, they won't be caught by these. And another point just to make, there's a Zen saying, first the mountains are mountains. In the second, the mountains are no longer mountains. In the third, the mountains again are mountains. So this is how it is when I think, inquire into truth. First things are straightforward, you accept them. But once we start inquiring into things, things become more not so clear in the beginning, they become more challenging, maybe even more complex. Sometimes tremendous complexity reveals itself in our quest. But I do feel that when we go into this, then there's a point where this complexity begins to give way to simplicity. And then again, the mountains are mountains. But they're not exactly the same as the mountains are mountains in the first thing. I don't know I think you Indian folk can easily take this kind of conundrum rather than Westerners with their, black and white logic.
Very well said. Thank you, Donald. I think we have crossed our time limit, but we can take two quick questions. Mr. Dinesh Waghmare and Mr. Pradeep Prakash.
Please be brief. Yeah. Sir,
okay, Dinesh, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. While talking about this ignorance, you said that if there is a awareness of the ground, then this ignorance will not be there. So this ground which you are talking is, do you mean to say that it is a substratum of the whole system? Or what you are referring to this as?
Yeah. Well, again, in Buddhism, it's spoken about in different kind of words are used. Like sometimes the word ground is used. Sometimes the word space is used. Like the Sanskrit word dharma, dhatu, the space of everything, the space of all phenomena. So that's, you could say about the space from which everything appears from. There's the sacred space from which all life appears, like occurs in. But so we can, matter of language, some will refer to this ground as emptiness. Some will call this ground primordial wisdom, the wisdom intelligence is at the very source of it. So it's just different. The words can never quote, as Krishnaji said in what I quoted at the beginning, the words can't grasp this, but we'll find Krishnaji still uses words. He uses words and images to give us a sense of this. The Buddhists also have a lot of different, terms. They can talk about that ground as being the ground as compassion, as intelligence, as emptiness, as I say, space. This space which is imbued with all pervasive intelligence. So they make statements like this intelligence just pervades all of life, all sentient beings, all human beings, all sentient beings, everything is of that space, but it's not recognized. It's not a thing. So there's so this is, this is my response to your question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donald. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Donald.
Hi.
Donald, you appeared to me in Rajghat in 2019 March, and then you disappeared, and now you have reappeared as Donald in this. So
that's why things are, isn't it?
Yeah.
Reality.
So how are you? It's nice hearing you and connecting back with you. I don't have any comment or nothing. I just enjoy, resonate with your speaking energy, and it is really a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you, Donald. It was nice.
It's a pleasure for me to, as I said at the beginning, to be back in India. I've missed journeys to India, yes. And it's wonderful to see my Indian friends. Have meant a lot to me, and I have deep appreciation of the time I spent in Rajghat and other places like Bangalore, and I can only say it was deeply meaningful for me to inquire with wonderful friends and serious seekers of truth, and so my gratitude to all of you.
Thank you, Donald. I have a last question from Mr. Prashad Mulpuri. He has put it in the chat box. He says, "Sir, how is thought a friend, and how it is also meditation? Would you please explain this aspect?"
Oh, that's a difficult one. Well, the way I would understand it is that, you see, it's said that merely thought is the expression of mind. It's the display of the mind itself. But because of whatever way the mind has configured the consciousness, it appears as something separate that almost invades or haunts us. Now, when this is first understood that the thought and mind are not two, then this problem ceases, as it were. So this misunderstanding is no longer there. So then this would be for the meditator in that tradition I've been talking about. Maybe Krishnaji, I don't know. But then you see, most of the traditional meditators, thought comes up and it's a problem, or too many thoughts. But for the one who has some understanding, the thought is merely the display of the mind's energy. So in fact, it wakes up the meditator, you know. So a strong emotion itself even is said is also the dynamic energy of the mind itself. When it's split off from the perceiver, then it's problematic. But when this division goes, then things arise as the energy display of the mind itself. And in that, when let's say, and again, the language is a little crude, when the meditator can abide in this, then the thought itself is not something other than the meditation. But this is a little difficult topic because, on the other hand, I have to add to that. I'm talk about meditator. The root problem in meditation and the so-called practice of meditation is the meditator. The meditator is the central problem with meditation. The meditator has to somehow depart. Difficult topic, I think, and I think that's the best I can do for the moment. I'd need to think about it a little bit more or meditate.
No, you put it very well, Donald. Thank you so much. We come to the close of the session now. I want to thank Donald for sparing his time and in being with us and giving such a wonderful talk. I want to thank you once again on behalf of the Indore Study Circle and hope to hear you once again sometimes in future. Thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, and thank you very much. And namaskar.
Namaskar.
Before next Sunday's topic and speaker.
Yeah, next Sunday we'll have the usual from starting from 11 o'clock. And our speaker next Sunday is Ms. Jayashree Nambiar. Many of you would know she was principal of the school Chennai for many, many years. She's the secretary of that school now. And she would be talking about thinking about authority and power. So you're all welcome to join at 11 o'clock, 11 a.m. in the morning next Sunday. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Good night.
Modak, you may now put end to this.
Okay.